but it's Friday, and that means tomorrow's Saturday. We've got some fantastic wines to taste. Nicolas, thanks so much for your time today.
It's a pleasure, Antonio.
It's going to be fun. I don't know if I've ever told you this, but Pichon Comtesse is the first really great Bordeaux that I tasted as a young adult. So, every time I see this label, it evokes a lot of, sort of personal memories. So you've sent some fantastic wines, which we'll get into in a second. But I'm just curious well, first of all, I just want to thank you for your time on a Friday afternoon. I hope things are getting a little bit more, quote unquote, to normal there. What's the situation in Pauillac right now?
Well, afterwards, it's now 2 weeks that the official lockdown is over. But frankly, as for us working in the vineyard and in the cellar, the lockdown has started a week after having finished the pruning season. And because we have had such a wet and warm winter, we had herbs, everything in the vineyard, and the vine started to grow. So we had many things to do in order to work the soils, opening them, closing them, to remove secondary branches and secondary buds. And then came this period when you have to start spreading the vine to protect the crop. So afterwards, we have never stopped working. We were lucky enough, looking at the news to say, okay, as for us, we got to work every single day. And it's probably the best way to feel alive and confident. So that was good. And for sure, 2020 is a year where we have a lot to do and to think about.
Yeah, no, we're still only in June. I think there's a lot of stuff to happen yet. I'm curious because you have a very interesting background before you got into wine. So for people who don't know, tell us a little bit about how did you get interested in wine as a young person?
Well, I guess it's a very classic French family story when my parents were used to open a bottle of wine for a Sunday lunch, and as I can remember when I was very young, younger than 10, I was used to have a sip of wine in my father's glass and just to try to guess what kind of aromas were in the glass. And that was it. It was not for drinking, for sure, at that age, but just to guess aromas. And then step by step, I started to drink beer, then dry whites, and then reds. And in the other hand, I started my studies. I studied genetics. And then came this moment when I had to choose, okay, genetics is very interesting, but genetics applied to what? What kind of science? And once again, my father told me, okay, you have your own cellar in my cellar. You taste pretty well. You are very interested into wine. You run blind tastings with your friends just for fun. But what about wine? And I never even thought about being a winemaker or applying genetics to wine. And that's finally what I did. I started a PhD in genetics applied to wine and white wine, breeding species of yeast. That was very interesting. But after 1.5 years working in a lab, I just understood that I was not made to stay in a lab and with my microscope. It was wine, but it was much more microbiology than wine. So I stopped there. I became a soldier a few years, and then once back to Bordeaux, I decided to go back to school once again and to study agronomics and winemaking. And then I was lucky enough to learn the job in 2 beautiful houses, which are Chateau Aubryon in 2005, then Chateau Margaux in 2006. And then I started my career as a winemaker at Chateau in Saint-Estèphe. And since 2012, I'm the general manager and the winemaker of Pichon Comtesse in Pauillac and Pez in Saint-Estèphe.
Got it.
So
but you also
the road was not that straight, but it was interesting.
Yeah, because you also studied music at one point, right?
Here you are. Yeah. But long time ago, yeah, I was a student and I followed two cycles. I should say classic studies like genetics, and I also studied the opera singing. I've always kept in mind that maybe someday I could become a singer, an opera singer. But I know you know someone who is pretty much the same.
And you studied, you're a baritone, right?
Yeah, baritone. I started to sing some the tenor roles, but huge and large tenor voices. And then, but today I'm much more baritone or bass baritone. It's obviously it's easier when you woke up early in the morning. It's always easier to sing lower than higher notes.
Yeah. But you found your real calling in making wine, and biggest experience before Pichon Comtesse was at Chateau Morose.
Yeah.
Then you get to Pichon Comtesse, and one of the things that you have done is taken a look at the vineyard, and you've decided over the years that a lot of the Merlot was not necessarily in the best soils for Merlot, and a lot of the Cabernet wasn't in the best soils for Cabernet. So so you've redeveloped a lot. Tell us about that process, because I think it's one of the most significant shifts for your chateau, no?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty long story. It's a intellectual process first. When the Rousseau family and Champagne Louis Roederer bought the estate late 2006, one of the first thing they asked for was a geological map of the vineyard, under soil and soil, in order to try to match the geological map and the proportions of each grape in a vineyard. A few years later, I can remember having a very long vertical tasting of a few wines in the history of Pichon Comtesse. I can remember it was in 2012, and I must say it's a funny story because sometimes you just can't expect things. I asked the cellar master to open for me a vertical tasting. That was my day 2 or 3 after joining Pichon, and I was expecting him to open something like 10 to 12 different vintages, and afterwards he opened for me 1970 to 2010, every single vintage. So I was alone in the room, long table, 40 different vintages, and okay, go your way. Good. I had nothing to do in my day, I guess. So, but 40 different vintages to drink or to taste. And that was very interesting because back to the geological map, you know that the image of Pichon Comtesse is a lot about a huge proportion of Merlot compared to our neighbors, Latour, Lascaz, Pichon Baron. And finally, through this vertical tasting, I could figure out that finally the Pichon Comtesse I preferred were much more cab than I could expect. And on the paper, some of the old vintages of Pichon were already a lot about Cab Sauv and plus Cabernet Franc. So sometimes more than 80 or 85% of Cabernet Franc. And when we had a look on the proportions of each grape in this vineyard, that was for sure a lot about Merlot, nothing more than Cab Sauv, but we have had until 40% of Merlot in the vineyard, which is a lot. So what we have done since, and what we do since 2012 is to running a huge replanting program. So we put out 3 hectares out of 90, 3 hectares of vine every year. We let the soil having a rest during 3 years, and then we replant those 3 hectares. It gives us 2 opportunities. The first one is to changing a bit the proportions of each grape in favor of more Cab Sauv, you have guessed. And from 50% Cab Sauv, I think we will reach something like 65 to 70. And less Merlot from 40 to 25, 30%.
Yeah. So when you said, just to interrupt you for a second, when you said 85% just now, I think you said 85 Cabernet Franc, but you meant 85 Cabernet Sauvignon just a few minutes ago.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's sometimes 70 to 80% Cab Sauv, and you add something like 5 to 10% Cab Franc.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. You meant the Cabernet family.
Exactly. The Cab family is more than 80%, and it's not very rare. It's very often, finally. Yeah. So that's what we do, and it's not by chance that our 4 last vintages, the one we're going to have together, 16, 17, 18, and 19, we have a minimum of 70% Cab Sauv and always 5-6% Cabernet Franc. And it seems that it fits to the wine. It's not because you have more Cabernet Sauvignon in your blend that the wine is rough and aggressive and bitter. You can have more Cab Sauv than in the past, but trying to vinify them very softly and gently, and keeping in mind that you have to have this very silky, tensed, and very sharp tannic structure, but always with delicacy.
And so, as the Grand Vin will have more Cabernet Sauvignon, how does that impact the Reserve, your second wine? Is that also going to change?
I think at the end of the day, finally today, we have always a bit more Cab in Reserve than Merlot. Okay, it's 50 plus Cab Sauv and 40 something Merlot, and a sip of Cabernet Franc or Petit Verdot. Obviously, in the future, we'll have more Cab than this, but I want to keep those Merlot in the vineyard. I don't want to reach 100% Cab Sauv. It's not my state of mind, because when Merlot is ripe, but not overripe, ripe, fresh, fleshy, very fruity, it adds something to the blend. Of course, something about that makes Pichon Comtesse a bit different than the neighbors. You know. Less Merlot than in the past, but still some to keep this mid palate, the creaminess and the flesh of the wine that gives you the pleasure to drink. Finally, we make wine to drink it.
It's interesting. You mentioned your neighbors. So you're just in this incredible area that, as you said, Las Cases, La Tour, and Pichon Baron. Yep. So this is the southern end of Pauillac. And how would you compare for folks who are watching, who are interested in learning more about Pauillac as an appellation? How would you compare where you are towards the northern end of Pauillac, where you have Lafite, Mouton, Pontet-Canet, etc.?
Well, I guess that most of you know everything about Bordeaux and this beautiful wine area. But just in a few words, you have Bordeaux is in the southwest of France. And the city is crossed by a river coming from the Pyrenees Mountains to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, you have 3 main wine production regions: the south of Bordeaux with the Pessac-Léognan, Les Graves. You know those names: Aubryon, Aubailly, Domaine de Chevalier, and so on. The south of the south with the sweet wines, sweet white wines. Then let's go north. On the right bank of the river, on soil made of clay and chalk, you have 2 main appellations, which are Saint-Émilion and Pomerol, on which first the Merlot is very well adapted and secondary the Cabernet Franc. And on the left bank of the river, from the south to the northwest, that means from Bordeaux city to the ocean, you have 4 main appellations, which are Margaux, Saint-Julien, Pauillac, and then Saint-Estèphe. Basically, the more north you drive, the more gravelly, the more dry, and the more draining are the soils. And the consequence of this is that, in theory, the more north you drive and the more cab you can find in the vineyards, mostly. That also means that the more north you drive and the more tough, full body and massive are the wines produced. Pichon Comtesse is, let's say, on the border between Saint-Julien and Pauillac. Our soil is made of gravel, fine gravel, and the undersoil is a mix of clay and sand. So we have 3 sizes of rocks: clay, sand, and then gravel. I guess that gives the complexity to what we call the terroir, which is a very useful French word. When you don't have 3 or 4 hours to explain everything about vine, you talk about terroir.
I think that might be the single best explanation of Bordeaux that I've ever heard in such a short period of time. So I'm going to steal it in the future.
If you prefer, I can write a 150 pages book.
No, I like things that are compact. This is what they taught me in music school: is you have to say what you want to say in as few words as possible. So I love the idea of in-depth but brief is perfect. Great. So why don't we talk a little bit about wine? We have a bunch of wine that you sent, which is fantastic. Thank you. My guess is that a lot of people are really curious about 2019. So tell us a little bit about what the year was like at Pichon Comtesse.
Okay, in one word.
This might take more than one word, but what are the key things that people should, when you sort of think about 2019 on the left bank, in the part of Pauillac that borders Saint-Julien, because the other one I've always loved is Les Cazes. So there must be something about that area that really is exciting for me personally. But what are the 2 or 3 things about 2019 that readers should have in mind that really informs the style of the wines?
Yeah, as you know, viticulture is first agriculture. So it's a mix of scientific knowledges, but it's a lot about empirism, meaning that we are under the dependence of the nature and the weather, of course. 19 was a year of the drought, meaning that late June, early July, we could see the foliage turning from green to almost yellow because the water stock was almost empty. And our main question was, if we don't have some rain, we're gonna have very concentrated juices with very little, very small berries. So finally, what kind of wine can we make if we don't have the flesh, if we don't have the acidity, so freshness? And you know that French wines are a lot about the balance, strength and balance. Finally, drinkable wines. You know, something, you need the freshness to have something very, drinkable, easy drinking wine. And that was a very big concern for us. And finally, mid-July, we had something like 32 millimeters of rain in a couple of hours. And that was very good to, because the vine was very thirsty. And then we had the same 28 millimeters of rain on mid-August. And this rain was very, very important for cabs, because you know that cabs ripe later in the season than Merlot. Merlot ripe first, and then 1 to 2 weeks later, we have the Cab Sauv becoming ripe. But to finish their ripeness cycle, the vine needs some water to have a good and consistent photosynthesis cycle, and it needs water for this. And this rain we had mid-August allowed the vine to finish its cycle mid-October, 2 months later. So we were, it was kind of fear for us not to have enough rain. It's not that usual to hope for rain when you work as a winemaker, but we really needed it. And finally, we had a few drops in September, but that did not impact the state of health of the vine, so no rot. And so finally, after this fear of having a very dry and tiny crop, finally we have picked, we have had a beautiful harvest. And at the end of the day, in the glass, we have such a balanced wine, which is, it was not expected at that point, I must say. So that, we are very, very lucky this year, I must say.
And what about yields?
As for us, we have produced 42 hectoliters an hectare, which is an average for us. Once our replanting program will be all set in, let's say, 5 to 10 years, I think we will reach 45 to 50 hectoliters an hectare every year. So we're way up, but 42 is an average.
Got it. So this is the wine. I'm going to show it so everyone can see. So the first wine is the Reserve 2019. Hopefully I can show that well for everyone. As I get sometimes people have said that I don't show the bottles long enough, so I'm going to show it a good long time. What can you tell us about the 2019 Reserve?
Well, globally speaking, we don't apply the same recipe to each plot of our vineyard. I mean, we apply a single method for each of them. We have something like 70 to 80 different plots. And we have no vineyard dedicated to one label or to the other. So I don't want to know what kind of wine we're going to make with this plot or another one. I'm used to tell to my technical team that if tomorrow we can make 100% of Grand Vin, first label, let's do it. I guess it won't occur, but that's the goal we want to reach, to make a huge proportion of Pichon and maybe less than Reserve. Then each of those plots, we vinified them separately because we have one tank per plot. And then our blending sessions following the winemaking process, the first sessions, we run them completely blind. So once again, I don't want to know where the wines come from. It's a selection based on the balance, the quality of tannins, everything. But finally, all the efforts we make in order to improve the quality of Pichon, Comtesse, I guess it helps the Reserve to be better year after year. So through 19 Reserve, you have 51, the blend is 51 Cabernet Sauvignon, 26 Merlot, and 3 Cabernet Franc. Very fresh, very fruity, red fruits. You have hints of graphite as well, and chocolate.
It's a very sensual wine in this vintage. I'm curious, in looking at both of your 2019s, they both say 14.5% alcohol, and this is a topic that my readers have been asking a lot about. So I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on the alcohol? I mean, first of all, are those just temporary labels, or are those the actual amounts of alcohol for 2019? And second, what do you think about is this a trend for Bordeaux, or is it just a reflection of a warmer year? What's your take on that?
It's maybe both. Maybe both. It's a true concern because look at the wines made 25 years ago. They were 12 or 12.5% alcohol. I guess we live this period of climate change, and so far it seems that those 10 last years, our harvest occur in very dry and hot, warm, pretty warm conditions. So finally, juices are more concentrated, meaning that we have more sugar finally in the must. And so more sugar means more alcohol by fermentation. But in the other hand, I think it's not only a question of alcohol. When you still have the acidity, and that's the case, I think, with our 19s, the pH is 3.7, which is very standard, and it's a very good pH for us in order to keep the freshness and the acidity. The fact that this wine is still alive, I can't feel too much alcohol through the tasting. So more than alcohol, it's the balance between alcohol and acidity.
Yeah,
that's one of you. Maybe you.
No, my point of view on this is, I agree philosophically with the idea that the wines are all about balance, for sure. I think that today there's, I think all of us just pay a little bit more attention to what we're not just drinking, but what we're eating and drinking. And so now you go to the grocery store and you look at the snacks for your kids, and they say no GMO, and they have the little no GMO sticker on there, and there's just more of I don't think it's just about wine. I think it's just more of a broader concern of what we're eating and drinking. You go to a nice restaurant and they'll tell you where the cheeses are from or where the meats are raised, and I think it's just the same philosophy. We're just a little bit more attentive, and I just know that it's a topic that a lot of my readers are curious about and asking about, is alcohol levels in wine. So it's just interesting,
But for sure, 18 and 19, like 09 and 10, were richer in alcohol than usual. For instance, 17 is 13.7. So it's a half degree more. So 0.5% more.
So those are the right. I'm just trying to pour myself a glass of the Grand Vin without breaking anything in here, which would be a minor miracle. So when those labels that say 14.5, those are the actual alcohols for the 19s?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So now Grand Vin. This is your 19.
Yes.
What is your thinking about this wine now when you taste it?
So first, the blend for people who like figures. The blend is 71 Cabernet Sauvignon, 23 Merlot, and 6 Cabernet Franc. Petit Verdot this year. What I do think of it? Well, we're going to run this vertical tasting after you and me, but I think that this is the most accomplished vintage we have vinified since we use our new cuvery, which is behind me. We use it since 2013. It's a very, very efficient tool made of conical shaped stainless tank. And since we use it, it has taken time for us to learn how to use it. When you have 80 something different tanks, in terms of duration of pump overs, number of pump overs, and so on, you have to know how to use it. And as you know, we have only one trial every 12 months. So one vintage, one trial. And
that's why I don't make wine, Nicolas. People always say, why don't you make wine? That's exactly the reason why I don't make wine. I don't like those odds, but I'm glad some people.
And finally, since 16, I think we still improve details every year. So that's why finally, I'm not that surprised that we have so much precision and sharpness and balance in the 19 Pichon, because year after year, it's a question of removing or changing a few habits and so on. And my personal satisfaction as a winemaker is that my team and I, we have this feeling that we have achieved something till the next time, till the next vintage.
So with 71% Cabernet Sauvignon, that's actually a little bit on the lighter side, given where you want to be, no?
Yes. For instance, 16 is 75. 17 is, let me tell you, is 70. 18 is 71, and 19 is 71. So we are very consistent.
But we would expect that in time, that's going to go up a little bit, as you said.
Probably, yes. This year, 19, my feeling that the best Merlot were over the top. Probably the best Merlot we have vinified here for years. But there were a few, maybe 3 to 4 different plots. As for cabs, they were very, very, very homogenic. That's why I think on increasing the amount of cab in the future, because you can see the results. Even if some of the vines are very young, you can feel the sap, can feel the personality, the character of the wine. Very, even if the vines are young. So it's I think it's a good clue for the future, a good indicator, and they were very homogenic. So then, how do we make the selection? It's the own perception. It's very subjective. Why can I use this plot, not this one, or half of it? What gonna it add to the mid palate or to the final mouth? What kind of finish do I want? It's kind of this is the moment of the year when you are not an artist, but you have this opportunity to create something with what the nature has given to you. It's kind of interpretation. It's not a creation. It's interpretation of like a piece of music, as you know.
So are any of there's one of the most fun tastings that I've done in the last few years is showing up at your chateau in the spring, and you have a lot of single parcel samples, really technical. I don't know, usually there's 10 or 12, and it's, Merlot, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, maybe there's a Petit Verdot, and tasting the difference in these parcels. Are any of the younger vines yet old enough to be in Grand Vin, or is it all in reserve right now?
No. We have 2 plots which were planted in 2011. So that means that their first production year was 2013. So it's now 7 years of production, and they have integrated the blend of Pichon. 7 years. I mean, it's very young. They're supposed to live 60 to 70 years. So far, most of the younger vines are in reserve, but sometimes, and it's all the interest of blind tastings. Sometimes when you have a wine that can give you the freshness, the energy, the attack, and so on. Finally, once you have determined the blend of Pichon, then you have a look on the statistics and on the origins of each plot, and say, well, that's a good surprise. It's only 7 years, but we can try to blend this wine without this new plant. It's not better, so let's go for it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It'll be very interesting to see. Maybe one day we can repeat a vertical tasting at Pichon Comtesse and taste some of these newer vintages next to those really old, not they're old, but they're more aged, really nice older wines like we tasted a few years ago.
Yeah. Cool. When I will make a party for my retirement.
That's a long time from now.
I guess so.
Yeah. All right. So So those are the 219s. Might be fun. I have to tell you that this is Bordeaux is a very quirky region relative to other parts of the world because usually when people like me show up, the estate managers want to only focus on one wine, only want to focus on one vintage. And, that's very different from lots of other regions in the world. A lot of times, maybe Burgundy is an exception because, the cycle of the wines and when you can taste them versus when they're released, it's not like you can taste multiple vintages. But in other parts of the world, I think that there's a little bit more of an openness towards tasting other vintages side by side. So this is going to be really fun because we just tasted your 2019s, but we also have 18, 17, and 16. And usually those aren't comparisons that people like to do. So I think that's going to be fun. But here's the 18. And I imagine this wine is not bottled yet, correct?
No, it's still in barrel.
Yeah. So where is it exactly in its evolution? I mean, it's in barrel, but when will it be bottled?
In 1 month now. So it's, end of the aging in barrel. As for Pichon, we use 60% new oak and 40% one wine oak. Frankly, I'm not keen on using 100% new oak, but I'm very careful with respecting 18 to 19 month long aging. The longer, the finer, and for tannins, it's very interesting. At the end of the day, I think it's better to bottle a wine just before summer, because if not, you have to wait until late August or September when it's time to think on the next harvest. It's a period in time when your cellar is full of microorganisms, bacteria, yeast, and I prefer bottling a wine when the atmosphere is very clean, in order to help the wine to age longer in bottle too. So that's why from November, December, following the harvest, till June, 2 years later.
Okay. So, one of the things that a lot of winemakers are thinking about now is with climate change, with wines that have more alcohol by nature, to shorten the amount of time in barrel, to shorten the extraction with the wood. Is that something that you think about, or is it is your view really you're going to keep your aging more or less the same?
For any reason, and I could not explain, even if we can see we can see the effects of climate change, we still can take time to pick each plot when it's absolutely ripe, but meaning not only the ripeness of the fruit expression, but also the finesse and the refinement of tannins. It takes days before, it's not a rush when we're in the harvest. It's not a rush as it could be in certain regions of the world, I guess, South Africa maybe, or Australia for sure. We have time to pick grapes. So I have this feeling that this balance that you can taste in our wines, we also have it outside. Okay, we have more sugar than more alcohol, but we always can taste this balance with the acidity. So, so far, I'm not frightened by that point. Okay, same question in 10 years, and maybe it will be a complete disaster, but so far, so manageable.
But that hasn't led you to change your oak aging at all, right?
No. Well, it also depends on the kind of oak you choose for aging your wine. We try to we rack the wines every 3 to 4 months. If we need to wait a bit more not to disbalance the wine, we can wait 4 to 5 months. You know, once again, we try to keep the wine very quiet during the aging. So that's maybe why everything we do is balance is a key word. What kind of oak toast do you want? We never ask for toasty barrels, you know, to impact the taste or the taste or the balance of the wine. So fingers crossed, so far it's good.
Got it. Okay. So 18, when you taste the wine now, you're going to bottle it in a month. What is your thought on this? This wine's very expressive. I'm kind of shocked because usually this is the worst time to taste wine, about a month before bottling is like, that's kind of like, I think that's the other reason why when you visit Bordeaux on Primeur, the Chateau owners are usually very reluctant to show the vintage just before, because it's in its worst possible stage to taste often. But this wine is really expressive. What do you remember about 2018 as a year?
You know, it's the complete opposite as 19. Actually, the season occurred in very wet and humid conditions. And it was early July. And we asked ourselves the same question as in 19. What kind of wine can we make if we have only water? And finally, mid-July, it stopped raining. From a day to another, the forecast switched from a kind of December weather to a true summer. And it lasted until July 19. And because the water stock was full of water, it took time for the maturity to occur. So we picked the grapes until mid-October. We took time to pick absolutely ripe cabs, but finally what gives the flesh to this wine are the Merlot. So that's why year after year, in part of your head, you have your replanting program. And year after year, when Merlot also useful, so good, so complete, you say, okay, I love cab, but maybe I should keep a few Merlot in my vineyard. And 18, a bit like 09, you can remember, was also very fleshy and very expressive, and is still today.
Yeah, so this wine is not, I don't see quite that volume, but I actually see more freshness in this wine. There's more aromatic kind of component. All right, what's next? This vintage is one of the most, I think, one of the most interesting vintages in Bordeaux in the last 10 years is this vintage right here, 2017, which is marked by episodes of frost in some parts of the region. And I think that the overall perception of this vintage is not necessarily so great. I think part of that might be a pricing problem, but as I wrote earlier, I hate thinking about money and prices with wines, Nicolas, because it removes all of the passion. You know?
Yeah, I think, and I'm not sure I should talk about price from 19.
Well, that's a different story, but just in general, the whole, you know, I got into wine because it was fun, and it's a passion, and it still is, even though I have my house full of hundreds of bottles of wines that I have to taste and boxes everywhere. For me, it's still about passion more than anything else, as opposed to business or commerce. But anyway, we'll talk about 19, I guess, in a second for the market. But we're tasting 17 Grand Vin. So this wine is now obviously been bottled. We tasted this wine in December, just, you know, a few months ago, 6 months ago. So I remember when we tasted this wine from barrel, you also opened 1991, which was the last Bordeaux harvest with frost before 17. Obviously, I think one of the big changes for Bordeaux is not just at Pichon Comtesse, but the winery that you have today is not the winery that you had in 1991. Not to mention the fact that people, hopefully, there's an enormous amount of learning that happens over time, which is harder to quantify, but the tools, that are available today are very different from the tools that were available a generation ago. When you taste the 2017 today, what is your impression, or what do you remember about this year as a signature in the wine?
I can remember flying overseas to New York on April 25th or 6th, and just time to land at JFK, and I had a few messages on the phone telling me that we had severe frost in Bordeaux. And I was with a few Bordelais in the plane, and we were all scared. But I can't complain because we maybe lost 7% of the crop because of frost, as for us. So it's almost nothing. When some of our friends in Bordeaux lost the whole crop in one night or 2 nights. So that was a trauma for each of us, because as you can guess, it's a lot of work outside, and sometimes you just can't do nothing against elements, and that was it. Probably when I used the word terroir a few minutes ago, the proximity to the river is part of the terroir. Terroir is not only the soil; it's your location and what we call the microclimates around your vineyard. And by the way, here we are a few hundred meters from the river, and the river here is very large. It's something like 7 kilometers large. So we are between the ocean and a very large river. It's a water mass, huge water mass. And I guess it creates a game of air and water masses all around our vineyards and the vineyards all along the river. I mean, from Margaux to North Médoc. And what we can see is that when it's very hot, and when we have very high temperatures in Bordeaux, here along the river, you always have 3, 5, 7 degrees less. So it's not that warm. And 03, which was the last year of the heat wave in Europe and in France, most of the wines should have been already drunk, because there are these balance, too much alcohol, because the fruits were very concentrated, too much alcohol, lack of acidity. Our 03 are still very alive and fresh and almost teenagers. And that means that it was not that warm here. So we took time to pick grapes and to make a balanced wine. 91 or 17 is almost the same. It was not minus 10 degrees Celsius in the vineyard, but only, if I may say, minus 3 or 4. And it's not low enough for the vine to freeze. Finally, we have made a vintage. And finally, we have made what I do consider is what is a good wine. But I know the image and the reputation of the vintage has been made on the basis of this frost event. But I think it's probably the first vintage. I mean, I have this feeling we are writing a new chapter in terms of winemaking, fruit expression, delicacy of the tannic structure. And between 16 and 17, something has happened. And even if it's not at the same level as 18 or 19, I like this 17 because first, it's one of my children, and two, because I think that finally it's very in balance, and this 17 will never be famous because of 16 on the one side and because of 18 and 19 on the other side. But I think it's a vintage you should look at.
Yeah, I mean, this is a little bit lighter of a style, more aromatic, less body, less concentration. But, you know, I think one of the challenges for consumers, Nicolas, and I mean consumers, I mean the end person, you know, and I always think the end consumer. And to me, the end consumer is the most important person in the whole wine ecosystem, because that person is the reason why we all have a job. And that's a person who today goes into a store or goes online, buys a bottle of your wine or your neighbor's wine and drinks it. One of the challenges is these vintages like 16 and 18, they become speculative, and there's a lot of, in the price, there's a lot of speculation. And in vintages like 17 or 14 or 12, you have a price that's more closer to the actual value of the wine. And those are vintages that normal people like me, like those are vintages you could actually, and our readers, those are vintages that you can actually buy and drink and not worry about what you paid for it, not worry about if it's gone up in value and should you actually open this bottle, which happens. And so I'm a big fan of vintages like this, actually. And I always tell my readers, our readers, to buy the estate first and the vintage second, producer first, whether it's Burgundy or Barolo or Bordeaux. And the reason for that is that you will often find, it's very normal to find a great Chateau that makes a really good wine in a bad vintage or poor vintage or medium vintage.
Yeah.
But what you'd never find, hardly ever, is an average Chateau that made a great wine because the vintage was great. So I always think about, so anyway, this is for anybody watching, who is maybe thinking about, about some of these richer wines maybe being too much or too concentrated. I think 17 is obviously the opposite of that. The problem is, Nicolas, that people often say this, but then if the vintage has a bad reputation, that also scares me.
Okay, if you insist too much, next time we have only off vintages tasting.
Excellent. I'm in.
97, 02, 04, and 17.
Okay, let's get Neil too, so he can write those up as well. We'll have like two opinions of all the, we'll call that the ugly ducklings. That'd be fun, actually. I'm in. I mean, look. Let's be honest. The wines from the great vintages are supposed to be great. So, in one sense, it's exciting to taste those wines, but it's also not necessarily surprising. So, 16. I was lucky. I tasted. This is a 2016. I was really lucky because when this wine was bottled, I don't know how many times I tasted it, 4 or 5 different times, and it was just very special to me always. Let's see how it is today. I'm using the Grand Vin because if I don't give some of the folks on my staff a chance to taste this wine, they're going to kill me. So here's 16. All right, let's see. So here, I mean, this wine is a base baritone. It's rich, ample. You can feel the texture. A lot of times, I think, especially in American wine writing, or English wine writing, there's a lot of focus on flavors in wines. And I never really understood that because that's so personal. It's so olfactory, really, and flavors in wine change over time. Whereas a wine's texture and how it feels is how it's going to be the rest of its whole life. If the 17 is a more lighter vintage, it might gain a little weight in time, but it's always going to be a lighter vintage. And the 16 has this amplesse, and you feel that immediately. This breadth in its body. So it's fun to taste it again.
Like the 19, the 16, you frankly have this feeling that will never impact or turn this wine down. It will never shut it down. The wine is that big and sure of itself that you can age it years in barrel. The wine is always that balance, and as we have made it when we blended it, it's classic, vibrant Pauillac style.
Yeah, no, it's showing really beautifully, really rich, really powerful. To me, it's just classic. Kind of reminds me a little bit of 96, but it's not as aromatic right now. But it has this, I don't know how to describe it, but this volume, and it's just obvious that it has that volume, and that wine will always have that volume. because I just think textures and wines don't change so much. But I want to go back to something you mentioned before, which is the influence of the river for Pichon Comtesse, because there's another estate that you know really well that's also very influenced by its proximity to the river, which is Chateau. So what are the similarities and differences of these two chateaus where you've spent most of your professional career? Are there, I mean, obviously there's marked soil differences, but the river is really important to both of them. So I think it'd be interesting to hear your views on the similarities and differences between these two properties.
Well, as for the proximity to the river, we have almost the same situation. The soil at Morose is probably more big gravels, made of big gravels, and more gravelly and more draining. But potentially, Saint-Estèphe is an appellation where you can make true tough wines and big wines. And in Saint-Estèphe, Morose is probably the vineyard where you potentially can make a more massive wine than all the others. Okay, so what I've learned from this vineyard is that you really need to be focused on the tannins ripeness at the very moment of picking cabs. If not, you can make huge wines in which tannins take 25 years before integrating the rest of the wine. And frankly, I like to taste the wines that I've made before my son or my grandson. So I don't know 25 years.
Yeah.
So you have to take a lot of care about this very point. That's my memory. I don't know how they do work now, but in my memory, I was trying during the winemaking process to take care on the tannins, even during the early stage in barrel, to take care on the tannic structure during the blending sessions. The aromatic expression of the wine will come later. Be confident, it will come. Pichon Comtesse, the kinetics is not the same. You immediately, when you have started a winemaking, even when the alcoholic fermentation has not started yet, you have the balance between fruit and tannins. And actually, the challenge you have to deal with is to try to keep this acrobatic balance on stage from the very start of the winemaking, through the blend, and through the aging in barrel. So it's always, okay, let's be focused on the balance, always. But what is for sure is that, in my mind, what we're trying to do now at Pichon is to give a bit more backbone in the more mid-palate, to give to it a bit more Pauillac style that it had probably had in the past. You know, it's not a Bordeaux wine, it's not a Saint-Julien wine, it's a wine from Pauillac with the interpretation of Pichon Comtesse. It's a Pauillac made by Pichon Comtesse. And to get more backbone doesn't mean that you have to have over extraction, too much tannins. No, you have to feel the tube. It has to be full of tannins, but this tube doesn't have to be too large. If you want to keep the freshness, the balance, the elegance of the wine, you have to size it as well as it needs. And finally, this experience from Morose to extract tannins just as they need to be, I take the benefit of it right now at Pichon to give it a bit more shoulders. I know it's a woman, it's a feminine wine, but let's talk about parity.
Yes, for sure.
Masculinity.
Yeah. We have time for just a couple more questions. I'm curious. One grape we haven't talked about so much is Petit Verdot. We have a question from Sid about Petit Verdot. What is your vision for Petit Verdot in today's Pichon Comtesse?
Okay, the Petit Verdot, sincerely, I just can't understand it. I'm going to give you a few examples. The first one is 2014. The Petit Verdot were absolutely outstanding. And we used 6% in the final blend of Pichon. They were very expressive, elegant, which is not that usual with Petit Verdot, which can be very wild and grandiloquent, you know. In the other hand, 19 and 16, two great vintages. And the problem with the Petit Verdot is that most of the time you have to pick it, because once you touch the berry, the skin tears. And so it's the very moment of picking it. So in the following half day, you have to pick the plot. So you go and pick, and most of the time you have this feeling that it's too acid, it's too rich, it's too everything. Sometimes it gives an outstandingly good wine, and sometimes it's very disappointing. And when it's outstandingly good, like 16, the impact of the aromatic structure of the Petit Verdot is so huge on the final blend that you don't use it. And 16 Pichon, we have no Petit Verdot in the blend of Pichon. So it's so much work in the vineyard, because it's a very fragile vine, fragile to wind, to rain, to everything, that finally, even if it's good, you don't use it. It's, it's hard enough to keep out of Petit Verdot. So finally, I think we're going to keep 2 plots of Petit Verdot. The first reason is that it's a very local grape. And for the next generation, it's good to entertain and to still have this Petit Verdot. But I much more believe in increasing the amount of Cap Franc.
Okay, great. Well, we have time for one comment and one question. The comment is going to be mine, and I don't expect you to answer, but I just want to tell you that our readers are very concerned with the prices that some of your colleagues are coming out with right now. And so I'm just saying that, you know, that I hope that anybody watching this will think about the moment that we're in, because I know that our readers want to buy wine, but I think that it's also important to remember the moment that we're in, and that anybody spending money today for anybody's Bordeaux futures is taking an enormous amount of risk because of the macro situation. So as I said, I don't expect you to answer, but I'm just telling you, our readers are really concerned. So about wines that are too expensive en primeur. But my last question for you is, if you could sing any operatic role, which one would it be?
Rigoletto.
Rigoletto. Yeah. The baritone part, yeah.
The baritone part. I've tried Gilda, but it doesn't work.
That's for Halloween, maybe. Well,
maybe next
time. Okay. Well, for me, it would be a French opera. It would be Werther, Massenet. That would be my dream role.
That's good. That's good too. Yeah.
Oh, great. Excellent. Well, thanks so much for your time, Nicolas, on a Friday at the last minute. But I wanted to taste your wines, fresh as soon as they arrived. Cheers. Thank you very much. Thanks for everybody for watching and for your questions.